Karmelo Anthony's motion for a new trial has been denied by Judge Chitty. I was waiting to do a recap until we had a final decision, so now that it's in, let's get right into it. Before we get into everything that came out during this hearing, let's recap what Anthony's new legal team was asking Judge Chitty to do in the first place. Karmelo was convicted of murder in June for the fatal stabbing of 17-year-old Austin Metcalf at a high school track meet in Frisco, Texas. The jury rejected his claim of self-defense and sentenced him to 35 years in prison. After the verdict, Anthony brought in a new legal team led by attorney Russell Wilson and filed a motion for a new trial. Before that motion could even be heard, however, the defense asked to have the original trial judge, Judge John Roach, removed from the case. That motion was granted. A visiting judge found that Roach's post-trial interview, including his statement that the jury, quote, got it right, could cause a reasonable person to question his impartiality in deciding a challenge to his own rulings. So retired Judge Michael Chitty was assigned to hear the motion for a new trial, and that hearing lasted 2 days. There were several issues raised by the defense. One involved access to the original trial. Anthony's new attorneys argued that Judge Roach imposed unusually restrictive rules surrounding public and media access and that too much of this case had been handled outside of open court. Russell Wilson repeatedly referred to this as a, quote, shadow docket. He argued that after Anthony bonded out in April of 2025, there were essentially no public hearings until jury selection more than a year later, even though attorneys were continuing to discuss and resolve important issues in the case. The original court had explained many of those restrictions as security measures, and we learned during this hearing just how serious those concerns were. Prosecutor Bill Werski testified about threats against people associated with the case, threats against a judge who had reduced Anthony's bond, attempts to intimidate witnesses, fake autopsy reports circulating online, and bomb threats involving the courthouse. There were threats directed at both families. Werski said Metcalf's family had been swatted. He also described an incident involving armed white individuals following Anthony's family. Defense attorney Mike Howard had reportedly received threats as well. Werski testified that the situation became so serious that courthouse employees had to learn new bomb threat procedures. His position was that these unusual court procedures were not designed to hide what was happening. They were trying to keep people safe while protecting Anthony's ability to receive a fair trial in a case that had become extremely volatile online. But the biggest issue in this motion was not courtroom access. It was an unwritten agreement between the prosecution and Karmelo Anthony's original defense attorneys, what's called the gentleman's agreement. And this part is important because the existence of this agreement was not really disputed. Both sides acknowledged that there was what was repeatedly referred to as a gentleman's agreement. The basic idea was this: keep the trial focused on what happened underneath that tent at the track meet. Do not turn it into a character trial about Karmelo Anthony, and do not turn it into a character trial about Austin Metcalf. Both sides had information about these teenagers that could potentially be extremely damaging. And neither side wanted that material pouring gasoline onto a case that was already receiving national attention and becoming increasingly racialized online. Mike Howard, one of Anthony's original trial attorneys, testified that everybody wanted to, quote, turn down the temperature. And because that agreement existed, the jury never heard a substantial amount of information about either young man. During this new trial hearing, however, that information finally came out, and it was intense. A quick side note, why this agreement was not put in writing is a little bit beyond me. I need maybe a law professional to help me understand. This is a criminal case. Wouldn't you want that documented somewhere? The defense went through more than 20 pages of records concerning Austin Metcalf's behavioral history. Again, much of this came from juvenile, school, and investigative records and was not presented to the original jury. According to documents discussed in court, Austin and his brother Hunter had previously been involved in an incident involving racist and anti-Semitic graffiti. It reportedly included the N-word, references to the KKK, and unalive all black people, and Heil Hitler. Records also reflected multiple reported instances of Austin using racial slurs. There was an allegation that he bullied a black student in class. There were also behavioral and disciplinary issues involving anger and fighting. The records discussed during the hearing included an allegation dating back to elementary school involving bullying and assaulting a girl. Another reported incident from 2024 alleged that during an argument with a female student, Austin knocked her down and punched her in the stomach. There were school records involving fights, profanity, and disciplinary action. At one point, he was reportedly banned from attending basketball games for a season after yelling profanity at a player. Records also showed that he met with a counselor multiple times concerning anger or rage connected to football. There was another incident in which Austin and another student reportedly discussed bringing a gun to school the following day, which resulted in discipline. And the defense introduced other statements they argued demonstrated aggression, including a message from a previous track meet where Austin allegedly responded to KILL, that MF, when told someone behind the team bench was talking aggressively. None of this means that Austin's past determined what happened underneath that tent the day of the killing, and that was actually part of the reason both sides originally agreed to leave it out. The jury was supposed to decide whether Karmelo acted in self-defense based on what happened during that confrontation, not decide whether Austin was a good or bad person. But once the new trial attorneys began arguing this off-the-record agreement affected Karmelo's ability to defend himself, all of this information became relevant to understanding exactly what both sides had agreed to keep away from the jury. The state had roughly 75 pages of material concerning Karmelo Anthony. That included school records, police reports, cell phone extractions, text messages, photographs, and videos. Some of the most significant allegations involved violence, weapons, and Anthony's former girlfriend. Prosecutors said that on the same morning Austin Metcalf was killed, Karmelo's girlfriend reported to a school employee that Karmelo had been stalking her, involving driving by her home and refusing to accept the end of their relationship. The state also presented messages it said showed Karmelo repeatedly discussing guns, knives, and fighting. There were allegations that he had previously brought a gun and a knife onto school campus. There were messages concerning whether metal detectors would be present at the state fair because, according to prosecutors, Anthony was considering bringing what was referred to as a, quote, poker. There were photos and videos that prosecutors said showed him holding firearms. There were records concerning prior fights and school discipline. The state also pointed to messages where Anthony allegedly discussed punching people, including girls, and another old conversation concerning robbing someone for money. One of the most disturbing messages attributed to him involved stabbing someone and licking the blood from the blade. Another older message reportedly included a threat about shooting up a school. There were also extremely threatening messages prosecutors attributed to Anthony involving his former girlfriend, and prosecutors emphasized something that happened only hours before the fatal confrontation. At approximately 1 a.m. on April 2, 2025, Anthony allegedly sent a message saying he was, quote, low-key on the verge. Later that morning came the report from his girlfriend, and later that day, Austin Metcalf was stabbed. Prosecutor Bill Werski characterized Karmelo as having gone to that track meet, quote, spoiling for a fight. The defense obviously disputed the significance of that characterization. But here is the key point. The original jury heard essentially none of this background material about either teenager, and that was intentional. It was the product of the agreement between the lawyers. This is why that agreement became a problem. Karmelo Anthony's decision not to testify becomes central due to this agreement. His original attorneys, Mike Howard and Toby Shook, both testified at this hearing, and both said the defense had planned for Karmelo to testify. That makes sense from their perspective because their defense was self-defense, right? They believed it was important for the jury to hear directly from Karmelo about what he saw, what he perceived, and why he believed deadly force was necessary in that moment. Toby Shook told the court it was essential for the jury to hear Karmelo's explanation. But the prosecution and defense apparently had different understandings of how their gentleman's agreement would work if Karmelo himself took the witness stand. Werski testified that the agreement did not contemplate Karmelo testifying. The defense said they were shocked by that interpretation. Their position was essentially, how could you agree that this trial would stay focused on what happened underneath the tent without anticipating that the person claiming self-defense might testify about what happened underneath the tent? There was also disagreement about whether the defense had already opened the door to character evidence. The prosecution pointed to the defense mentioning during opening statements that Karmelo played chess. From the state's perspective, once the defense began introducing favorable information about Karmelo's character, that potentially changed the boundaries of the agreement, and then things became very heated. Howard testified that the attorneys argued in chambers and eventually needed time to cool down. Afterward, they tried to negotiate a way for Karmelo to testify without opening the door to this enormous amount of damaging background evidence. Howard said he actually walked prosecutors through the questions he planned to ask Karmelo beforehand so everyone could determine what would and what would not violate the agreement. And according to Howard, that was something he ordinarily would not have been required to do. Eventually, they reached some kind of workable understanding. But according to the defense testimony at this hearing, by then Karmelo no longer trusted that the agreement would protect him once he was on the witness stand. Shook testified that Karmelo believed Werski would find some reason during cross-examination to open the door to his background, so Karmelo chose not to testify. And remember what happened at the original trial. Judge Roach questioned Karmelo directly about that decision. Karmelo confirmed that he understood he had a right to testify and ultimately waived that right. So the new trial argument was not just simply the judge refused to let Karmelo testify. The argument was much more complicated. His new attorneys were arguing that the breakdown and confusion surrounding this unwritten agreement placed Karmelo in an unfair position at the exact moment he was deciding whether to exercise one of the most important constitutional rights he had. Wilson argued that the heated dispute damaged Karmelo's trust in the agreement and affected his decision not to testify. And the state's answer was basically that Karmelo was represented by experienced attorneys, the agreement was voluntary, his lawyers ultimately negotiated parameters under which he could testify, and Karmelo himself knowingly chose not to take the stand. That was, again, one of the central factual disputes that Judge Chitty had to evaluate. The defense also challenged portions of the jury instructions related to self-defense. Their broader argument was that the way the charge was presented improperly limited or distorted the jury's consideration of Karmelo's self-defense theory. That matters because self-defense was the entire center of the case. There was never serious factual dispute over whether Karmelo stabbed Austin. The question was whether that stabbing constituted criminal murder or legally justified self-defense. The jury heard the evidence, received the instructions, and rejected self-defense. Anthony's new attorneys argued that errors surrounding those instructions, when combined with the other issues they raised, deprived him of a fair trial. After 2 days of testimony and argument, Judge Chitty took the matter under consideration, and today he denied the motion for a new trial. I'm going off of news media outlets. I haven't read it myself, but it wasn't a lengthy written opinion walking through every allegation and explaining why he rejected each one. It was actually extremely brief. Judge Chitty states that after reviewing the motion, the record, the evidence, and the arguments presented, the briefs, and the applicable law, he determined that the motion should be denied. So at least from the written order itself, we do not have extensive findings telling us exactly how Chitty weighed the gentleman's agreement, Karmelo's decision not to testify, and the public access arguments or the jury instruction claims individually. All we know is the ultimate result. The conviction stands, the 35-year sentence stands, and Karmelo Anthony does not receive a new trial through this post-trial motion. Now let me make a very important distinction. This was not Karmelo Anthony's formal direct appeal. This was a motion asking the trial court for a new trial. His direct appeal of the conviction is a separate and much lengthier process, and that remains ahead of him. Because this case comes out of Collin County, that appeal goes to the 5th Court of Appeals in Dallas, which hears criminal appeals from Collin County. That appellate court will review the trial court record and the legal issues Anthony's attorneys ultimately raise on appeal, including what happened in this hearing. And depending on what happens there could potentially be additional review later through the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which is the highest criminal court in Texas. So legally, we're not done. So again, legally, this is far from over. I will continue to track the appellate case updates, and if there are any updated filings or if we get the judge's order and I can get my hands on it, I will break that down with you. As always, like, comment, share, subscribe for more updates, and I'll catch you in the next one.